Just off of Howard Street in Pottsville, Pennsylvania, tucked back against a hillside, is the Presbyterian Cemetery. At the top of the small grassy hill, towering over the toppled and worn-away gravestones, fallen in disrepair, stands the memorial for General James Nagle. General Nagle, who was born on April 5, 1822 in Reading, Pennsylvania, would go on to organize and command the Washington Artillerists in 1842 during the Mexican-American War. Nagle would serve as part of General Winfield Scott's force to siege Veracruz and fought heroically at many other battles during the campaign. Close to his memorial lie his brothers who also served with him: Daniel from Company D, Philip, captain of the 48th, and Levi, musician in the 48th Regimental Band. Also nearby is a gravestone for his adopted son, Emergildo Marquis, who was orphaned during the Mexican War and was taken in by James and his men and brought home and adopted. Emergildo would first serve in the 6th Pennsylvania, and then as a bugler in the 3rd Pennsylvania Cavalry. James's regiment, the 48th Pennsylvania Volunteers, the Schuylkill Regiment, was composed of men from Pottsville, Port Clinton, Tamaqua, Minersville, Schuylkill Haven, and even some from Hamburg and Berks County, among others. They were boatmen on the Schuylkill Navigation. They were rail workers and laborers, miners and farmers, and their skill, ingenuity, and grit would show the world what these Schuylkill County men could survive and accomplish. Since April 12, 1861, the United States has been in a state of war with itself. On April 15th, President Lincoln calls for 75,000 militiamen to be called up and quell the rebellion and serve a term of 3 months. In July, the federal forces under General Irwin McDowell are handed a defeat at the First Battle of Bull Run. Washington, D.C. is soon fortified with a series of earthworks and forts. In August, in Wilson's Creek, Missouri, the Federals are handed a second defeat. Meanwhile, the Union forces rushed to close all the southern ports along the Carolina coast. Colonel Nagle, who served as the colonel of the 6th Pennsylvania Regiment during Lincoln's 3-month service, was authorized by Governor Andrew Curtin on the 14th of August, 1861, to raise and organize a regiment. As the men were recruited, they were sent to the main training and consolidation camp of Pennsylvania, Camp Curtin in Harrisburg. Camp Curtin was originally the Dauphin County Agricultural Society in the northern outskirts of Harrisburg. Governor Curtin instructed the grounds to be taken over. By the end of the war, over 300,000 men would pass through the camp, making it the largest federal camp during the Civil War. Over the next few weeks, the new recruits would receive their gear and do some light drilling. On the 24th of September, 1861, the regiment was ordered to Washington, D.C. They boarded the North Central Railway and set off. When they reached a train station in Baltimore, they were diverted. They left the train and marched 2 miles to the Baltimore Wharves. From there, they boarded the steamer Georgiana and headed to Fortress Monroe, just off of Newport News in Virginia. Fort Monroe, or sometimes called Fortress Monroe, was built after the War of 1812 when the United States realized they had to protect the inland strategic ports at Hampton Roads from an attack at sea. In March of 1819, President Monroe's War Department came up with a plan of building and maintaining coastal defenses. The fort was completed in 1834. In May of 1861, Virginia seceded from the Union. President Lincoln quickly reinforced Fort Monroe so it couldn't fall to Confederate forces. This successfully allowed full Union control of the fort through the entirety of the war, and provided a jump-off point for most Federal forces. When the men from the 48th arrived at Fortress Monroe, they were put into a camp across the bay in Hampton, dubbed Camp Hamilton. This is the place where their training truly began. The man in charge of Camp Hamilton was a man by the name of General Joseph King Fenno Mansfield. Night after night, General Mansfield would walk through the camp through their defensive picket lines without being questioned, and end up at Colonel Nagle's tent. He would then inform Colonel Nagle exactly how he got there. The lack of vigilance from his men enraged Colonel Nagle, who made his men drill all the harder. This quickly taught the men to be extra vigilant in their duties. Soon they were one of the best trained units around. In fact, eventually it was so hard to get through the 48th picket line that the colonel of the 1st Delaware, who was stopped and questioned at the line, declared, "These Pennsylvanians would as soon shoot than look at you." Sunday the 10th of November, they boarded the S.R. Spalding and set sail for Hatteras, North Carolina. Hatteras Island forms part of the eastern boundary of North Carolina. Hatteras is around 40 miles long and varies in width from half a mile to 3 miles wide. Most importantly, at the time, Hatteras Inlet was the main entrance for vessels into the Pamlico Sound. On either side of this inlet were earthworks. makeshift redoubts dubbed Fort Hatteras and Fort Clark. When the 40th arrived at Hatteras, they were met by the men they were replacing from the 20th Indiana. A few months earlier, a horrible storm blew through North Carolina and destroyed most of the 20th's equipment and shelters and drowned a number of men. When the 48th first met the 20th, they all looked at the point of death. They were all shabby and disheveled. It made the Pennsylvanians wonder what they were in store for. When the Schuylkill County boys first stepped off the gangplank of the S.R. Spaulding, they were greeted by a deserted wasteland. There were no trees, no bushes, not even a blade of grass. One soldier commented this place looked like the last spot made. The creation having been accomplished in a week, there was no time to plant grass. Basically, to them, it looked like the end of the world. They soon marched to the twin forts. The only way to get across from Fort Hatteras to Fort Clark was wade the inlet, which could be 5 to 6 deep in places at low tide. Miner's Journal of the 18th of November, 1861. At 8 o'clock on Tuesday morning, we dropped anchor off of Fort Hatteras and succeeded, after considerable difficulty, in getting a plank from an old wreck. Down this plank, which had an elevation of at least 45 degrees, our regiment landed one man at a time. Having at last reached shore, we formed a line on the beach and took up our line of march for Fort Hatteras, about 1/4 mile up the beach. When we had accomplished 1/2 the distance, the regiment halted to make preparations to wade an inlet separating us from Fort Clark. In 10 minutes we were moving again, and such a funny-looking set of men, some without breeches in their drawers, and many without either, and it was a laughable, enjoyable sight and furnished much amusement to the men. When they finally made it to the forts, they were faced with a number of challenges. First, they couldn't easily set up their tents in the sand. Secondly, the wind was so fierce that even if they got their tents set up, they'd try to blow away the whole time, or blow away after they were completely set up. There were makeshift barracks that were left for them that some of the men could billet in. The men lovingly dubbed these Camp Louse for their ramshackle appearance. From the 48th in the War, being a narrative of the campaigns of the 40th Regiment Infantry, Pennsylvania veteran volunteers during the War of the Rebellion. Misery loves company. So the feelings were somewhat soothed by hearing all about in the darkness fellow soldiers engaged in the same delightful occupation, growling and grumbling, and yes, they went the whole figure, swearing at the blast of Hatteras, whilst a comfortable barrack lodger, with his mouth at a convenient crack between the boards of his hut, propounded the never-to-be-forgotten, "Who wouldn't want to be a soldier?" There are some small huts on the beach owned by locals, and the officers soon took these over. There's no drinking water to be found. The wells left by the 20th Indiana were just basically giant holes that they shoved barrels into. If they were deep enough, eventually fresh water would seep into them. Hatteras was not completely abandoned, however. There was a little town. Most houses were tiny and square-shaped, up on poles. There was no wallpaper in the houses, and most houses used newspaper and other such paper to line their walls. There was a bar called the Swash, which ended up being really important to the soldiers. The residents of Hatteras set up their own state government during the war against the Confederacy and devoted themselves to the United States of America. Besides the occasional rebel tugboat that would take small pot shots at the island, nothing ever attacked them. The man in charge of Hatteras was a gentleman by the name of Thomas Williams. Let's just say no man under his command was a big fan. General Williams was tyrannical and rigid. He'd bark out orders and give frequent calls for duty. He would excessively drill the men 5 times a day and give overly thorough inspections. The men of the 48th would eventually remember him fondly, agreeing that his harsh discipline made the regiment a group of well-trained and hard soldiers. The 48th was commissioned to go a few miles up the beach and erect barracks. This would eventually be dubbed Camp Winfield. The soldiers complained they never got a chance to use Camp Winfield and had the idea that the reason they were being made to build it was just to give them something to do. So they built the camp and held a picket line from the Atlantic to the Pamlico Sound because Roanoke Island up the coast was still held by the Confederacy and they were concerned with an attack. Their first Christmas season away from home was spent in relative ease. They gathered seashells to send home, visited the Hatteras Lighthouse, spent many frequent days at the Swash. This would be their last truly comfortable moment for a very long time.